So really, I see two interpretations or conclusions you can draw. Either Joseph Smith was bringing in a late insertion from the Gospel of Mark, which may not have been in the original manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, or this was Mormon writing the authentic words by Jesus to the Nephites, and Joseph Smith translating it into King James Bible English, and that the long ending of Mark, whether it was in the original copy of Mark or just later inserted, but it existed before its attachment, but it still could have been authentic words of Jesus, and that this doesn't necessarily disprove the Book of Mormon. Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. So we're continuing our series on the Book of Mormon. In the last episode, we looked at the Sermon on the Mount, comparing it to the sermon at the temple in 3 Nephi 12 to 14, when Jesus, after his resurrection, visited the Nephites in the Americas. And critics would say that, Joseph Smith is the author, just copied or plagiarized from the Sermon on the Mount in the King James Bible. And we looked at, some of the differences, Jesus changing the currency of farthing to the Nephite Sinai, or him being perfect like his father after his resurrection. But critics would point to things such as the Aramaic word raka that wouldn't have had any relevance to the Nephites, the doxology at the end of the Lord's Prayer being in a late edition, not in the earliest manuscripts, or the Roman law of going a mile twain. And we had a look at some of the apologetic responses. So go back and watch that one. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the long ending of Mark in Mark 16, verses 9 to 20. Aren't in the two earliest manuscripts that we have access to. Calls into question, were they original to the Gospel of Mark, or is this just a late edition? And the Book of Mormon in Mormon 9 quotes verses from the long ending of Mark when Jesus is speaking to the Nephite apostles, calling into question, and Joseph Smith borrowing or plagiarizing from the King James Bible, not knowing that this is a late edition. And we're going to be having a look at some of the critical conclusions and the apologetic responses. So this comes from jefflindsay.com, and he sort of outlines on his website, which is a really great resource for looking at both evidence to try to support the Book of Mormon and the church and responding to critical issues. It's a really great resource. He's a great scholar, and he's done an article which I'm going to cite at the end from the interpreter on the long ending of Mark. But he sort of outlines the problem. He said, one of the most effective and interesting arguments against the Book of Mormon is that it quotes from the disputed ending of the Gospel of Mark. In Mormon 9, 22 to 25, Mormon quotes from the disputed ending of the Gospel of Mark. He quotes words spoken by Christ to his disciples in the New World that gave them essentially the same commission that Christ gave his apostles at the end of the Gospel of Mark. However, there is a real problem, for the quoted words from Mark should not be in the Bible and are a late, spurious addition according to the consensus of most Bible scholars. The two earliest extant New Testament manuscripts both have the Gospel of Mark ending at Mark 16 verse 8, with the two women, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James, amazed and afraid as they stand before the empty tomb. And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. So according to modern scholars, the following verses, known as the longer ending of Mark, covering the appearance of Christ to Mary, and then the apostles in the Great Commission to preach the gospel, should not be there, and may not have been inserted into some manuscripts until much later. So what's it doing in the Book of Mormon? Ascribed to Christ and his teachings to the disciples. If the words in the longer ending of Mark were not in Mark's gospel, and not spoken by Christ, it would be unlikely that Christ would quote them or words similar to them in the New World. And that's essentially the argument. It's not in the earliest manuscripts that we have of Mark. It is in all the later ones. And we're going to look at some of the apologetics for maybe some evidence to support it being authentic. But the consensus of scholars is that it's not in the earliest manuscripts. And critics would say, if this calls into question if these are the authentic words of Jesus to his disciples, then why is it being quoted? Jesus giving the same commission, saying the same words to the Nephites in the New World, and is this a problem? So we're going to look at what LDS Discussions has to say. The long ending of Mark has become a consensus among scholars to the point where some translations of the Bible actually provide a disclaimer to note that the earliest manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not include Mark 16, 9 to 20. While there are some who dispute that the longer ending was not originally included, There are many reasons that scholars are almost unanimous that this ending of Mark was a late addition. This again points to the Book of Mormon being a 19th century text written by someone who owned the King James Bible and was familiar with 19th century ideas of Christian beliefs. In the case of the longer ending of Mark, it shows that the author of the Book of Mormon included late material, just as they did with Deutero-Isaiah passages and late addition to the Lord's Prayer in the Sermon on the Mount. So they would say that Joseph Smith wouldn't have known about, the long ending of Mark not being in the earliest manuscripts, being a late addition, and that this shows that he is just borrowing or taking from the King James Bible and attributing the words of Jesus in the Bible to him when he visits the Nephites. And we're going to look at the scholarly reasons for why this is believed to be a late addition. So this comes from New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman. He says the evidence that shows these verses were not original to Mark is similar in kind to that for the woman taken in adultery. And again, I don't need to go into all the details here. It is absent from our two oldest and best manuscripts of Mark's Gospel, along with other important witnesses. The writing style varies from that we find elsewhere in Mark. The transition between this passage and the one preceding is hard to understand, and there are a large number of words and phrases in the passage that are not elsewhere found in Mark. In short, the evidence is sufficient to convince virtually all textual scholars that these verses are an addition to Mark. So he outlines the three reasons why they believe it's a late addition. It's not in the two earliest manuscripts that they have of Mark's Gospel. The writing style varies, and he also said that there's a large number of words and phrases that aren't elsewhere in Mark. And we're going to look at maybe some of the apologetic responses later. So this is the passage, and it is near enough identical. So this comes from Mormon 9. So this is Jesus speaking to his disciples. And he says, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, shall they speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." And this comes from Mark 16. "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." And this is word for word identical, the quote in Mormon 9 to Mark 16. And a believer might think, well, that kind of makes sense. Jesus could say the exact same words to the apostles and disciples in the Americas as he did to the ones in Jerusalem, but it becomes more problematic. One, he would have spoken this in Aramaic, and then after oral tradition decades later, it was written in Greek and then translated into King James Bible English. But then on top of that, it's compounded upon the fact that was this the authentic words of Jesus, or was this a later insertion by scribes later on by a different author? Joseph Smith, not knowing this, had Jesus quoting words to the Nephites, which he may not have actually spoken to his disciples in Jerusalem. This comes from a letter from my wife, and they say the ending to the Gospel of Mark is another undivine addition to the Bible, and again we see the Book of Mormon going directly from the King James Version. If the Book of Mormon prophets only had the brass plates available to them, portions of the New Testament should not appear in its pages, especially not a part of the New Testament that was only later created to fill in missing text. And we've talked about New Testament passages in a previous video. Go watch that one if you haven't, and what are they doing. But yes, there are phrases and long quotations from the King James Bible in the Book of Mormon, which could be viewed as textually anachronistic or out of proximity to the Nephites. And we sort of looked at sort of the loose translation, and that Joseph Smith, as the translator, was translating the text and the characters of the gold plates in his language, in his vocabulary, is probably the way, as a believer, you would probably make sense of New Testament passages. But this is even more compounded upon. This is perhaps a late addition to the Gospel of Mark. So a critic's view or response to the long ending of Mark, those verses being quoted in the Book of Mormon, they say there is no possibility here when you look above and see that the verses from Mormon is 100% identical to the verses from the long ending of Mark. There is no denying that the King James Bible influenced the Book of Mormon, because the verbiage in the Book of Mormon is not a direct teaching of Jesus. It is the King James Bible's translation of what Jesus taught that was twice translated, only written down after decades of oral tradition and from an ending that scholars believe was a late addition. This is what is so frustrating with apologetics. You're told not to believe what you can see with your own eyes and read with your own mind. But in the case of the long ending of Mark, the anachronistic nature of the New Testament appearing in the Book of Mormon is compounded by the fact that these verses were not even written by the author Mark, but by a later scribe. Just as with Deutero-Isaiah, Joseph Smith was unaware that the ending of Mark had been added hundreds of years after the first manuscript. So when he integrated this material in the Book of Mormon, he made a massive mistake when looked at through biblical scholarship. In other words, Joseph Smith was already copying verses from the King James Bible into the Book of Mormon that could not have possibly been known to the Book of Mormon people, but in many instances, including the long ending of Mark and the Lord's Prayer, using material that was added well after the initial authors composed their Gospels. However, that argument falls apart when we see Joseph Smith using both texts and ideas that were not written at the time Nephi left. More importantly, for the case of Mark, were not composed until hundreds of years after the first manuscripts of the Gospel were composed. So that's, I think, the critical response and conclusion of showing up in the Book of Mormon, that Joseph Smith is just taking and plagiarizing from the King James Bible, that this was a late addition by a scribe, that Bible scholars believe this wasn't in the original manuscripts and may not have been the authentic words of Jesus. And it's also problematic that even if Jesus gave the same words to the Nephites, that they would be translated in King James Bible English. And again, I think the apologetic response would be, and we did a video on the King James Bible, is that that is Joseph Smith's language and vocabulary, and he as the translator would be translating it into his language, his vocabulary, which would be the King James Bible in the King James Bible English. So let's have a look at some apologetic responses. So Ferris' response, they say, before jumping to conclusions about the authenticity of either Mark 16:15-18 or Mormon 9:22-24, there are several considerations to keep in mind. First, in recent years, several scholars have argued that the text in Mark 16:9-20 is indeed an authentic part of the Gospel of Mark. These scholars note that many other early New Testament manuscripts contain these verses and bring a wide array of additional evidence together, making a credible case for the early inclusion of the long ending of Mark's Gospel. Because the textual evidence is extremely complex, legitimate questions about the history of the long ending of Mark remain. But the possibility that it was an original part of the Gospel of Mark is a defensible position to take. And we're going to be looking at an article put into the Interpreter, written by Jeff Lindsay, and he talks about early Christian documents that would corroborate the long ending of Mark being authentic and possibly even being in the original manuscript of Mark, which we don't have. It is also significant that several scholars who reject Mark 16:9-20 as part of the original Gospel of Mark nonetheless believe that the long ending pre-existed its attachment to Mark. This means that even if it was not originally part of Mark's Gospel, it likely stands as an early independent witness of the resurrection, containing the authentic teachings of the Savior's post-resurrection ministry. So they believe that even if the long ending of Mark wasn't authentic to the original Mark Gospel, they still believe that it was stands as sort of like a independent witness of words that Jesus would have said after his resurrection to his disciples, and it would have pre-existed. Another important detail to keep in mind is that even among those who reject the authenticity of Mark 16:9-20, there is considerable debate about how the Gospel of Mark originally ended. Some believe it ended as a dramatic cliffhanger at Mark 16:8. Others, however, argue that there is another lost ending or two. And the lost ending, it may not be identical to the long ending that we have now. We don't know if it would be the same as the long ending of Mark that was inserted in later manuscripts. It is impossible to know exactly what such other endings would have said, but N.T. Wright argues that it most likely would have been similar to the current ending, including a commission similar to that in Mark 16:15-18. So basically in the earliest two copies that we have of the Gospel of Mark, there isn't the long ending, verses 9-20. They're in all the later ones. There's debate whether or not it would have ended at verse 8, but it does seem like kind of an abrupt cliffhanger ending. Some scholars believe there would have been a longer ending. Perhaps it just wasn't attached to it. Was it identical to verse 9-20, or was it something different? There's different debate on that. So this is what Book of Mormon Central have to say. So they say, on the grounds that this teaching is based in the authenticity of the longer ending, this doesn't propose a significant problem for the Book of Mormon. They note that this problem doesn't have to hinge on its authenticity. They say it's important to recognize that even though the English translation of Mormon 9:22-24 was possibly influenced by the King James translation of Mark 16:15-18, I think there's no possibly about it, it is word for word identical. Moroni's source was not the Gospel of Mark. Rather, Moroni was drawing on the teachings of Christ recorded among the Nephites. Thus, the authenticity of the words of Jesus in Mormon 9:22-25 is not ultimately dependent on the authenticity of the long ending of Mark. Indeed, belief in the authenticity of these words in the ending of Mark may, on the other hand, benefit from the testimony of the Book of Mormon. So this basic apologetic is that even if the long ending of Mark is an original to the Gospel of Mark, this doesn't immediately discredit the Book of Mormon, because Moroni is quoting the teachings of Christ and the words that he spoke to the disciples, and that the authenticity of the words of Jesus, that it's not dependent upon the authenticity of the long ending of Mark, and it may even support the long ending of Mark, that this would have been in the original, it's just not in the two earliest manuscripts that we have. But even if it wasn't original to the ending of the Gospel of Mark, this is Joseph Smith translating what Moroni wrote by what Jesus said. Now, I know a critic would say, well, that's convenient, and that's really dependent upon if the Book of Mormon is historical, but it's more likely that it's Joseph Smith just taking from the King James Bible, quoting from the long ending of Mark. So we're going to look at what Jeff Lindsay has to say. And he provides, I think, actually some compelling evidence to support that the long ending of Mark is authentic, and it's in some early Christian writings. So he says 95% of the existing ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament have the longer ending of Mark. The problem came with the relatively recent discovery of the two oldest extant manuscripts. If the concepts in Mark 16:9-20 were fabricated long after the Gospel of Mark was written, it is difficult to understand how some of the earliest Christian documents we have provide support for their authenticity. And he lists a few, such as the Epistola Apostolorum by an unknown author, the First Apology by Justin Martyr, the Diatessaron by Tatian, and Against Heresies by Irenaeus. I think it's also in the Book of Clement as well, or First Clement. What we learn from the earliest Christian evidence is that there are much earlier manuscripts of Mark known in the Christian world, but not extant today, that support the authenticity of the longer ending of Mark. This strengthens the possibility that Christ actually spoke the words quoted at the end of Mark 16, and that he could have spoken similar words to his New Testament disciples, or New World disciples, in the Book of Mormon, as quoted in Mormon 9. So there's early Christian documents that have the long ending of Mark, supporting that these are the authentic words of Jesus. Yes, it may not have been the earliest two manuscripts, but then it was either it wasn't attached to the original, maybe it was removed or lost somehow, and then it was later attached because these were authentic words, or it was not a part of the original Gospel of Mark, but it's still recognized by the early church fathers and the writers of the Gospels that this was part of the. So really what he's saying is that we have evidence from early Christian documents to support the passages being authentic, the authentic words of Christ, words and teachings to his disciples, which may or may not have been in the original manuscript of Mark, but this also supports that he could have spoken similar words to his New World disciples in the Book of Mormon. He also says, this is in his article in The Interpreter, that there is an abundance of evidence from early Christian sources, such as the writings of early Christian fathers, liturgical materials, and New Testament manuscripts and translations supporting the authenticity of the longer ending of Mark. We have 1 Corinthians 15:3-5, which states that Christ died for our sins, was raised on the third day, and was seen by the 12. Gordon Fee concludes it is generally agreed that in verses 3-5, Paul is repeating a very early creedal formulation that was common to the entire church. Without the longer ending, the basic creedal system of the early church is incomplete in Mark. In terms of content, it defies logic as Snap observes that Mark would end the gospel with the women fearful and silent as if they had disobeyed the commandment to tell others about the resurrection. It was well known in the Christian community. If the longer ending is so obviously a fraud, how could it have been used and apparently accepted by Irenaeus? So it was later accepted as authentic. And if it was a later addition or invention, then why would the Christian community have accepted it? There are also objections to the grammar in the longer ending as being uncharacteristic of Mark, but for such a short work, however, almost any section can be shown to have unique features that stand out from the rest of Mark. So they're saying that the unique writing style and grammar doesn't mean that it wasn't authentic to Mark, and that being such a short work, you might see that. If the concepts in Mark 16:9-20 were fabricated long after the Gospel of Mark was written, it is difficult to understand how some of the earliest Christian documents we have provide support for their authenticity. So they're saying that if this was just a later fabrication by the later sort of scribes adding it into the later manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, then why are there earlier Christian documents supporting the authenticity of the long ending of Mark? Either it was part of the original Gospel of Mark or it wasn't, but there's evidence to support that these are authentic words that Christ spoke to his disciples after his resurrection. Modern scholarship provides excellent resolutions to the alleged Book of Mormon problem of Christ quoting from the longer ending of Mark. In his words to the Nephites in the Book of Mormon, extensive external and internal evidence weakens the arguments against and provides powerful evidence for the authenticity of Mark 16:9-20. There is no reason to suppose that Christ did not speak those words and give his apostles the apostolic commission found at the end of Mark. There is no inherent problem with the similar commission given to the disciples in the New World by the Savior. And that's sort of from his conclusion of his article. I'll put the link in the description. You should check out his article and dive into it. There is a lot of debate and complexity between Bible scholars, but I think he lays out some important evidence and reasons to think that the long ending of Mark could be authentic as well, and why this may not be problematic for Jesus giving the same words to the Nephites in the Americas. But a critic's response, LDS discussions, so they would say that we know that the translation of the Book of Mormon was influenced by the King James Bible, so the use of the word possibly is what is otherwise known as a weasel word. And yes, there's no question that there is a reliance and dependence upon the King James Bible in the dictation of the Book of Mormon, whether or not you believe it was Joseph Smith or whether or not he was doing an inspired translation. There's no possibly here when you look above and see that the verses from Mormon is 100% identical to the verses from the long ending of Mark. There's no denying that the King James Bible influenced the Book of Mormon because the verbiage in the Book of Mormon is not a direct teaching of Jesus. It is the King James Bible's translation of what Jesus taught that was twice translated, only written down after decades of oral tradition and from an ending that scholars believe was a late addition. And I think we've provided some counter evidence to support, yes, it is not in the two earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, but there are some early Christian documents to support that these were the authentic words of Jesus to his disciples. And even if it wasn't in the original Gospel of Mark, I think it can still be authentic words, even if it's not attached to the original Gospel of Mark. The use of the New Testament in the Book of Mormon is highly problematic, and the use of the long ending of Mark is another clear illustration that the author of the Book of Mormon was someone with access to the King James Bible. When you look at how the Sermon at the Temple is a retelling of the Sermon on the Mount with italics, late additions, and phrasing, that means nothing to the ancient Americas. And then look at how the long ending of Mark is an exact copy from the King James Bible. There's no getting around the fingerprints being left by the author of the Book of Mormon. And that's a very understandable conclusion to draw from this, that there's no question the New Testament is being quoted throughout the Book of Mormon, the King James Bible. There's the dependence upon it, and you could just view this as Joseph Smith as the author. He knows the Bible very well, and he's either intentionally or subconsciously quoting from the King James Bible, and he's also quoting the errors, things which would be considered late additions, such as the Gospel of Mark not being in the earliest manuscripts. And this just shows that Joseph Smith is the author, and this is a 19th century text. And I think that's definitely a conclusion you can draw. I think there's also some apologetic responses and conclusions you can draw as well. So conclusion slide. Mark 16:9-20 isn't in the two earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark that we have, but the verses in the later long ending of Mark are in the Book of Mormon that Jesus supposedly says to the Nephites. How could they be there if it is a late addition? Many scholars believe this is a later insertion, and critics state that the Book of Mormon having a passage from the long ending of Mark, which is, if it is a late addition, not in the earliest manuscripts, this wouldn't have been known to Joseph Smith, similar to like Deutero, Isaiah, or like the doxology on the Sermon on Mount, that this is evidence of Joseph inserting or borrowing from the King James Bible and bringing in an error or a late addition, which wasn't in the original, pointing to him being the author and the Book of Mormon being a 19th century text. Apologists point to some scholars believing in the possibility of the long ending of Mark being in the earliest manuscripts, or that it pre-existed its attachment to the Gospel of Mark. Some scholars argue there is a lost ending to Mark, which might resemble verses 9 to 20, or that the long ending of Mark is quoted in other early non-scriptural writings. And you can read more about that in Jeff Lindsay's article. Some apologists state how the verses in Mormon 9 come from Jesus and could have come independent from the Gospel of Mark, and whether it's authentic to the last chapter of Mark or not, it isn't devastating to the Book of Mormon because Jesus could have spoken those words to the Nephites. However, I would say there does seem to be a dependence and quoting the same wording as the King James Bible in Mark 16. Some LDS scholars like Jeff Lindsay point to early Christian documents supporting the authenticity of the longer ending of Mark, supporting that they are authentic words by Christ to his disciples in the Old World, and that he could have given a similar apostolic commission to the Nephites in the New World. So really, I see two interpretations or conclusions you can draw. Either Joseph Smith was bringing in a late insertion from the Gospel of Mark, which may not have been in the original manuscripts, the Gospel of Mark, or this was Mormon writing the authentic words by Jesus to the Nephites, and Joseph Smith translating it into King James Bible English, and that the long ending of Mark, whether it was in the original copy of Mark or just later inserted, but it existed before its attachment, but it still could have been authentic words of Jesus, and that this doesn't necessarily disprove the Book of Mormon. And I'll let you come to your own conclusion on the matter. We're going to be looking at Deutero-Isaiah in the next episode, which is a big topic. It's probably one of the biggest issues for scholars and for believers when it comes to the Book of Mormon. So I'm going to be doing a bit of research on that. But if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.